All right, so take a look at joint orientation, and let's see what's up with that. So I'm going to grab my joint tool. I'm going to create a very simple skeleton. So let's just do your typical leg, right, where there's a little bit of a bend at the knee, perhaps. So if we were to actually look at the local rotation axes for these, so we can actually see what's going on here. I have a button for that. Or you could go into, where is it here? So display, transform display, and local rotation axes. So just right there. And again, I'm just going to turn those on. And I'm going to duplicate this out a few times. There's a couple ways we can do this. The first way is using the tool, so the Reorient Joints tool. So that's located under the rigging module, skeletons. Let me just tear that off. And we have that right here, Orient Joint tool. So there we go. And let me just reset this. So typically you have something that looks like this. This is actually probably set up correctly. So primary axis is the axis that's pointing along the joint. So that's the one that's aiming at the next joint. So that's right. So that's the default X. And then secondary axis is the one that we want it pointing up or down from that joint. So in this case, Y is correct. So if I just use the defaults and click apply for this one joint here, well, nothing happens. So if nothing happens, it's just a matter of switching the positive to negative, or vice versa, depending on what your setting is, because we just want it to flip to the opposite side. And there we go. So that's an easy way to do that. So typically, I would suggest using that. Now there's a couple other ways we can approach this. The second one is to actually select the local rotation axes. So we can do that in the component mode over here. And I'm just going to turn everything off, except for if I right click on the question mark, I just want to have the local rotation axes on. So you have to select the joint, it gets highlighted, and then we can control shift, select the local rotation axes. And I could just move that around. So if I bring up my rotation manipulator here, so the E key, I could just rotate that around. Now I suggest going into that rotate manipulator, so in the toolbox over here on the side, and just setting the relative to maybe 45 or 90. And by doing that, we get a nice discrete snap. So if we go by 90, maybe it's a bit easier to just very quickly snap it to exactly 180 degrees in the opposite direction. I wouldn't just manually rotate it and eyeball it, because if it's slightly off, then this won't be planar anymore. So it's going to bend in a slightly randomized direction. So again, we want to make sure it's very, very specific. So again, this is a good way to do that. Just switching the step snap from off to maybe relative or absolute. Either of those is fine. The third way is using a command line to do the same thing. So again, I'm just going to select the joint, and this time I'll just do a rectangle select over, just to select that LRA. The order doesn't matter. I could have done the same thing over here as well. And then we can do a command line. So it's just rotate, if I can spell rotate properly, -R for relative. And then we've got these 3 zeros here. So again, the zeros represent X, Y, and Z. So we're rotating an X as we've looked at with the other two. So if I type in 180, basically that's just going to rotate that now 180 degrees around in X. So same thing. Now the third option, which is probably easier than just going through the entire selection process like what I'm doing right here, is just going into the attribute editor for the joint, and then we have our joint orientation down here. So you can see that our orientation in X right? So X is what we've been rotating so far for all of these. It's set to 180 degrees. So if I zero that out, that also does the exact same thing, right? So if I look at any of these joints, you can see that after I've kind of done the operation that I've done here, all of these have been reset back to 0. This one's a -0, but I'll make it 0. Cool. So 4 different ways to do the exact same thing, but I suggest getting used to using the orient joint option. It's just faster, especially if you have to do, you know, multiple joints and things like that. Anyhow, some food for thought. So I'm going to stop the recording there, and hopefully this was useful.